Captain Sarah Martinez never imagined that her Tuesday morning briefing would change everything. The humid air of the naval base in Virginia Beach clung to her flight suit as she walked across the tarmac, her boots clicking against the concrete with practiced precision. At 28, she had already logged over 2,000 flight hours in some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. But today felt different. The call had come at 0600 hours. All available combat pilots were to report to Hangar 7 immediately. No details, no explanations, just the stark command that sent ripples of curiosity through the squadron. Sarah had been preparing for a routine training exercise when her phone buzzed with the message that would redirect her entire day. As she approached the massive hangar, Sarah noticed the unusual activity. Black SUVs with tinted windows sat parked in formation near the entrance. Men in civilian clothes moved with the unmistakable bearing of special operations personnel, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Whatever this meeting was about, it was far from routine. Inside the hangar, Sarah found herself among 37 other pilots, all looking equally puzzled. The familiar smell of jet fuel and metal polish filled the air, but the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. She recognized most of the faces around her, fellow aviators she had trained with, flown missions alongside, and shared countless stories with in the officers' club. Lieutenant Commander Jack Torres nodded in her direction from across the room. They had graduated from flight school together 3 years ago and had maintained a friendly rivalry ever since. His questioning look mirrored her own confusion about why they had been summoned with such urgency and secrecy. The conversations were hushed but animated. Speculation ran wild among the group. Some thought it might be a new training program. Others wondered if they were being briefed on a classified mission. A few of the more experienced pilots exchanged knowing glances, suggesting they might have an idea of what was coming, but they kept their thoughts to themselves. At exactly 0700 hours, the hangar doors sealed shut with a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the space. The casual chatter died instantly as 3 men entered from a side door. The first was Admiral Richardson, a man Sarah recognized from previous briefings. His weathered face bore the marks of decades at sea, and his presence commanded immediate respect. Behind him walked 2 men Sarah had never seen before. The first was tall and lean, with the kind of intense focus that seemed to see everything at once. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the fact that he moved like a predator, every step calculated and purposeful. The third man was shorter, but powerfully built, with scars on his hands that spoke of experiences far beyond typical military service. Admiral Richardson stepped forward to address the assembled group. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, without question. He explained that they were being considered for a highly classified operation that would require skills beyond conventional pilot training. The mission details would only be shared with those who volunteered and passed the initial screening. The room remained silent as he continued. This operation would involve working closely with special operations forces in an environment where traditional air support wasn't possible. They needed pilots who could think creatively, adapt quickly, and operate independently in hostile territory. The risks were significant, and anyone who participated would be operating under complete radio silence for extended periods. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the implications became clear. This wasn't just another mission. This was the kind of opportunity that defined careers and tested everything she had learned about flying and combat. The kind of challenge that separated the good pilots from the truly exceptional ones. The taller of the 2 unknown men stepped forward and introduced himself simply as Captain Morrison. He didn't specify which branch of service he represented, but his bearing suggested special operations. His eyes swept across the group of pilots with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating potential assets. Captain Morrison began to describe the general parameters of the mission without revealing specific details. They would be operating in a region where conventional aircraft couldn't provide support. The terrain was mountainous and hostile, with weather conditions that changed rapidly and without warning. Enemy forces in the area had sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities that made traditional bombing runs impossible. What they needed, he explained, were pilots who could fly low, fast, and silent through terrain that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. The aircraft they would be using were modified versions of standard military helicopters, equipped with advanced stealth technology and specialized weapons systems that most of the pilots had never encountered. The mission would require them to insert and extract special operations teams in locations where a single mistake could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. They would be operating without backup, without radio contact with command, and without the safety net that conventional military operations provided. Sarah listened intently as Captain Morrison outlined the training program that would prepare selected pilots for the operation. 6 weeks of intensive instruction, covering advanced navigation, stealth flying techniques, emergency procedures in hostile territory, and weapon systems that weren't part of standard pilot training. Only half of those who volunteered would successfully complete the program. The second man, who introduced himself only as Commander Hayes, added details about the physical and psychological demands of the mission. Pilots would be operating under extreme stress for extended periods. They would need to make split-second decisions with incomplete information while flying in conditions that pushed both aircraft and human capabilities to their limits. Sleep deprivation, hostile weather, and the constant threat of enemy contact would test their mental resilience as much as their flying skills. The selection process would evaluate not just their technical abilities, but their capacity to function effectively under pressure that went far beyond anything they had experienced in previous training. Admiral Richardson concluded the briefing by emphasizing the voluntary nature of their participation. Anyone could leave immediately, with no questions asked, and no impact on their career. Those who chose to stay would undergo an initial evaluation process that would determine their suitability for the program. Even volunteering didn't guarantee selection for the final mission. The room fell silent as the weight of the decision settled over the assembled pilots. This was clearly an operation that would push them beyond their comfort zones and into territory that few military aviators ever experienced. The risks were real and significant, but so was the opportunity to be part of something extraordinary. Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had always dreamed of flying. Her father had been a commercial pilot, and some of her earliest memories were of sitting in cockpits and listening to him explain how aircraft worked. When she was 12, he had taken her to an air show where she watched military pilots perform maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. From that day forward, she knew she wanted to be a combat pilot. The road had been challenging, requiring her to excel academically, while maintaining the physical fitness standards demanded by military aviation. She had faced skepticism from instructors who doubted whether women belonged in combat roles, but she had proven herself through performance rather than words. Her training had been intense and comprehensive, covering everything from basic flight principles to advanced combat tactics. She had learned to fly in conditions that ranged from perfect weather to storms that seemed designed to test human limits. Each phase of her education had prepared her for increasingly complex challenges, but nothing had prepared her for an opportunity like this. As she stood in the hangar, surrounded by her fellow pilots, Sarah realized that this moment represented everything she had worked toward. The chance to test her skills against the most demanding challenges military aviation could offer. The opportunity to work alongside the most elite forces in the military and to contribute to missions that could have strategic importance. The risks were undeniable, but they paled in comparison to the possibility of being part of something that mattered. Sarah had joined the military not just to fly, but to serve her country in meaningful ways. This operation, whatever its specific details, clearly represented that kind of service. Looking around the hangar, she could see her fellow pilots grappling with the same decision. Some faces showed excitement and determination. Others reflected uncertainty and concern. A few pilots were already moving toward the exit, having decided that the risks outweighed their interest in participating. Captain Morrison announced that those who wished to volunteer should remain in the hangar for initial interviews. Those who preferred not to participate could leave immediately. No judgment would be passed either way, and their decision would remain completely confidential. Sarah watched as roughly a third of the pilots made their way toward the exit. Their departure left behind a smaller, but clearly committed group of aviators who were willing to take the next step into the unknown. The atmosphere in the hangar shifted as only the most determined and curious pilots remained. The interview process began immediately. Pilots were called individually to speak with Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes. Sarah noticed that each conversation lasted approximately 20 minutes, after which some pilots were asked to wait in a separate area while others were dismissed. The selection criteria weren't obvious, but it was clear that not everyone who volunteered would advance to the next stage. As she waited for her turn, Sarah reviewed everything she knew about her own qualifications and experience. Her flight record was exemplary, with commendations for performance under difficult conditions and leadership during complex training exercises. She had proven herself capable of making quick decisions under pressure and adapting to changing circumstances without losing focus or effectiveness. More importantly, she had demonstrated the kind of mental resilience that military operations demanded. During her deployment to Afghanistan, she had flown missions in hostile territory where enemy fire was a constant threat. She had successfully completed extraction missions under fire and had never lost a crew member or failed to complete an assigned objective. When her name was called, Sarah walked confidently toward the interview area. Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes sat behind a simple metal table, their expressions giving no indication of what they were looking for in potential candidates. The questions they asked were direct and searching, designed to reveal not just her technical competency, but her psychological readiness for the unknown challenges ahead. They asked about her most difficult flying experiences, how she handled stress and uncertainty, and what motivated her to volunteer for an operation with such limited information. Sarah answered honestly, explaining her commitment to pushing her own limits while serving her country to the best of her abilities. The interview concluded with Captain Morrison asking a single question that would echo in her mind for weeks to come. He wanted to know if she was prepared to operate independently, without guidance or support, in situations where her decisions could determine the success or failure of critical missions. Sarah's answer was immediate and unequivocal. She was ready for whatever challenges they could present. 3 weeks into the most grueling training program of her military career, Sarah understood why only half the volunteers would complete the course. The modified helicopter she now piloted bore little resemblance to anything she had flown before. Every control surface had been altered for stealth operations, requiring her to relearn fundamental flying techniques she had mastered years ago. The aircraft responded differently to every input. The rotor system had been redesigned to minimize noise, which meant sacrificing some of the power and responsiveness she was accustomed to. The advanced navigation systems required her to think 3 steps ahead of where conventional aircraft would position themselves. Flying this machine was like learning a completely new language while trying to have a conversation. Her training days began at 0400 hours, with physical conditioning that pushed her body to its limits. The instructors explained that combat operations in mountainous terrain demanded exceptional physical fitness. Pilots might need to survive for days in hostile territory if their aircraft went down. They could face situations requiring them to carry wounded team members across difficult terrain while avoiding enemy patrols. The mountain training facility in Colorado provided the perfect environment for these lessons. At 8,000 feet above sea level, every physical activity was more challenging than at sea level. Sarah found herself gasping for breath during exercises that would have been routine at lower altitudes. Her body gradually adapted, but the adjustment process was exhausting and sometimes discouraging. Navigation training took place in conditions designed to simulate the worst possible scenarios. Instructors would take her to unfamiliar terrain during bad weather and require her to find specific coordinates using only basic instruments. GPS systems could be jammed or destroyed by enemy action, so she needed to master traditional navigation techniques that many modern pilots had never learned. Flying through mountain passes in heavy clouds, while navigating by compass and landmarks, tested skills she hadn't used since basic flight training. The margin for error was minimal. A wrong turn could lead her into a mountain face hidden by clouds. Miscalculating altitude could put her aircraft into terrain that would destroy both machine and crew. The weapons training introduced her to systems that existed only in classified programs. The modified aircraft carried armaments designed for precision strikes in close quarters. Unlike conventional air-to-ground missiles, these weapons required her to operate within range of small arms fire. She learned to engage targets while maintaining the stealth profile that kept her aircraft invisible to enemy radar. Sarah discovered that accurate shooting from a moving helicopter required completely different skills than conventional gunnery training. The aircraft's stealth modifications affected its stability in ways that influenced weapon accuracy. She spent hours learning to compensate for these factors, while maintaining the precise positioning required for successful target engagement. Emergency procedures took on new meaning in this training environment. In conventional operations, pilots could expect rescue if their aircraft was disabled. In this program, they learned to assume they would be on their own if something went wrong. Every emergency scenario required them to prioritize mission completion over personal safety. A mental shift that challenged fundamental survival instincts. Sarah practiced auto-rotation landings in terrain where conventional helicopters couldn't touch down safely. She learned to find landing zones in spaces that seemed impossibly small and navigate approaches that required her to fly between trees or around rock formations. Each landing was an exercise in precision flying that demanded perfect judgment and flawless execution. The psychological preparation proved as demanding as the technical training. Military psychologists worked with each pilot to develop mental strategies for operating under extreme stress. They learned techniques for maintaining focus during extended periods without sleep, and methods for making critical decisions while under enemy fire. Sarah participated in scenarios where instructors used various methods to create realistic stress levels. She flew missions while sleep-deprived, under simulated enemy fire, and with deliberately malfunctioning equipment. The goal was to ensure that stress wouldn't impair her decision-making abilities when lives depended on her performance. One particularly challenging exercise required her to complete a complex navigation course, while instructors shouted conflicting orders and created distractions designed to break her concentration. The exercise simulated the chaos of combat operations, where multiple radio voices, weapons fire, and equipment malfunctions created an environment of controlled chaos. During these scenarios, Sarah learned to filter out irrelevant information while maintaining awareness of genuine threats and opportunities. She developed the ability to prioritize multiple competing demands while continuing to fly with the precision required for mission success. The mental discipline required was unlike anything she had experienced in previous training. The academic portion of her education covered enemy tactics, equipment capabilities, and terrain analysis. She studied satellite imagery of potential operational areas, learning to identify landing zones, enemy positions, and escape routes. This intelligence would be critical for mission planning and real-time decision-making during operations. Sarah learned to recognize the signatures of various anti-aircraft systems and understand their capabilities and limitations. Some enemy weapons could track targets at low altitudes, requiring her to fly in specific patterns that minimized exposure while maintaining mission effectiveness. Other systems were vulnerable to particular approach angles that she could exploit. Understanding enemy communication patterns became another crucial skill. By recognizing how opposing forces coordinated their activities, she could anticipate their responses to her presence and plan accordingly. This intelligence allowed her to time her approaches and departures to minimize the risk of detection or engagement. Weather analysis took on critical importance in mountainous terrain where conditions could change rapidly and without warning. Sarah learned to read subtle signs that indicated approaching weather changes and plan mission timing accordingly. Flying in clouds wasn't just dangerous because of terrain. It could also compromise the stealth characteristics that kept her aircraft hidden. 3 pilots had already left the program, unable to master the demanding combination of technical skills and psychological pressure. The remaining candidates had formed a tight-knit group, united by their shared commitment to completing the training successfully. They studied together, practiced together, and supported each other through the most challenging aspects of the program. Lieutenant Commander Torres had proven particularly adept at the stealth flying techniques, while Sarah excelled at precision navigation and weapons employment. They often partnered during training exercises, learning to complement each other's strengths and compensate for individual weaknesses. The teamwork they developed would be crucial if they were selected for the actual mission. Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes observed every training exercise, taking detailed notes and conducting frequent evaluations. Their assessments covered not just technical competency but psychological readiness, adaptability, and leadership potential. They were looking for pilots who could function independently while contributing effectively to team operations. Sarah noticed that the evaluations became increasingly rigorous as the training progressed. Instructors created scenarios with no clear correct solution, forcing pilots to make decisions based on incomplete information and changing circumstances. These exercises tested their judgment under pressure and revealed how they responded to ambiguous situations. One particularly memorable exercise required her to extract a simulated wounded team member from a landing zone under enemy fire. While her aircraft suffered multiple system failures, she had to balance the competing demands of aircraft control, navigation, defensive maneuvering, and crew coordination, while maintaining the calm leadership that kept everyone focused on mission completion. The scenario concluded successfully, but Sarah realized how much the training had changed her approach to flying. She now thought in terms of contingencies and alternatives, rather than standard procedures. Every flight plan included multiple escape routes and backup options. She had learned to expect the unexpected and prepare for situations that couldn't be anticipated. As the training program entered its final weeks, the intensity increased dramatically. Exercises became more complex and realistic, incorporating elements that simulated actual combat conditions. Sarah flew missions at night in bad weather, while navigating by instruments through terrain that would challenge experienced pilots under ideal conditions. The aircraft's advanced systems proved their value during these demanding scenarios. Stealth technology allowed her to approach targets undetected, while sophisticated sensors provided information that conventional aircraft couldn't gather. The weapons systems delivered precision strikes that minimized collateral damage while ensuring mission effectiveness. Sarah's confidence in the aircraft grew as she mastered its capabilities, but she also developed deep respect for its limitations. The stealth modifications that made it invisible to radar also affected its performance in ways that required constant adjustment. Flying this machine successfully demanded complete understanding of its unique characteristics. Night vision systems allowed operations in complete darkness, but they created their own challenges. The artificial view of the world took time to interpret correctly, and depth perception was limited compared to natural vision. Sarah spent hours learning to navigate and engage targets using these systems, while maintaining the situational awareness required for combat operations. Communication procedures for the mission emphasized radio silence, except in genuine emergencies. Pilots would operate independently for extended periods, relying on predetermined signals and timing rather than constant coordination with headquarters. This independence was both empowering and isolating, requiring exceptional confidence in individual judgment and decision-making abilities. The final week of training included comprehensive evaluations that tested everything they had learned. Sarah flew multiple missions under various conditions, while instructors assessed her performance in every aspect of the training program. She demonstrated technical competency, tactical awareness, and the psychological resilience required for independent operations in hostile territory. Her final evaluation included a complex scenario that required her to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining mission focus. Enemy positions shifted during her approach, weather conditions deteriorated, and equipment malfunctions created additional challenges. She successfully completed the mission while demonstrating the flexibility and judgment that the program was designed to develop. Captain Morrison congratulated her on completing the training program, but emphasized that graduation didn't guarantee selection for the actual mission. The final team would be chosen based on mission requirements that were still being developed. She would know within days whether her weeks of demanding preparation would lead to the operational assignment that had motivated her participation. As she cleaned her gear and prepared to return to regular duties while awaiting the final selection decision, Sarah reflected on how much the training had changed her as a pilot and as a person. She had discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and developed confidence in her ability to handle situations that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. The waiting period would test her patience as much as the training had tested her skills. Everything she had worked toward over the past months would be decided by factors beyond her control. but she knew she had given her best effort and developed the abilities required for whatever challenges lay ahead. The call came on a Thursday evening while Sarah was reviewing flight manuals in her quarters. Captain Morrison's voice was brief and direct. She was to report to a classified facility 2 hours outside the base at 0600 the following morning. No additional details were provided, but the tone of his voice told her everything she needed to know. She had been selected. The drive to the facility took her through countryside she had never seen before, past security checkpoints that became increasingly sophisticated as she approached her destination. The final gate required biometric identification and confirmation from multiple sources before allowing her access to what appeared to be a standard military installation from the outside. Inside, she discovered a complex that bore no resemblance to conventional bases. The buildings were designed for secrecy rather than efficiency, with underground connections and blast-resistant construction. Everything about the place suggested operations that couldn't be conducted at regular facilities. Sarah found herself in a briefing room with 5 other pilots who had completed the training program. Lieutenant Commander Torres was among them. Along with 3 others she recognized from the grueling weeks in Colorado. They had been joined by Captain Lisa Chen, a Marine pilot whose reputation for precision flying was legendary throughout the service. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as they waited for the mission briefing that would finally reveal what they had been training for. Maps covered the walls, but they were draped with sheets that concealed their contents. Electronic equipment hummed quietly in the background, suggesting sophisticated communication and planning capabilities. Admiral Richardson entered first, followed by Captain Morrison and Commander Hayes. Behind them came a man Sarah didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to commanding special operations. His presence suggested that this mission involved the highest levels of military leadership. The civilian introduced himself as Director Walsh, from an agency he didn't name. His briefing began with a detailed explanation of intelligence that had been gathered over months of careful observation. Enemy forces had established a significant presence in a mountainous region where conventional military operations couldn't reach them effectively. The terrain was too rugged for ground assault, too heavily defended for conventional airstrikes, and too remote for sustained operations using standard equipment. Satellite surveillance had identified the location of key facilities, but destroying them required precision strikes that only specially trained pilots in modified aircraft could deliver. Director Walsh explained that the enemy had chosen their location specifically because it seemed unreachable by American forces. They had built their facilities in valleys, surrounded by peaks that created natural barriers to conventional aircraft. Anti-aircraft defenses covered the few approaches that standard helicopters could use, making traditional assault impossible. The mission would require 6 pilots operating independently to approach the target area from different directions, using terrain features to mask their presence until they were within striking range. Each pilot would be responsible for specific targets identified through months of intelligence gathering. Coordination would be minimal to avoid compromising stealth. Sarah studied the satellite imagery as Director Walsh described her assigned objectives. Her targets included a communications facility built into a mountain face and a supply depot located in a narrow canyon. Both would require approaches that pushed her aircraft and training to their limits while maintaining the precision necessary for mission success. The timeline was unforgiving. Intelligence indicated that enemy forces were planning to relocate within 2 weeks, making this a narrow window of opportunity that might not arise again. Weather forecasts showed a brief period of favorable conditions during the 3rd week of the month, providing the visibility and wind conditions necessary for successful operations. Captain Morrison took over the briefing to explain operational procedures. Each pilot would launch from different locations to avoid detection and follow routes designed to bring them to their targets simultaneously. Radio silence would be maintained except for genuine emergencies, requiring each pilot to operate independently while trusting that others were completing their assignments. The modified aircraft had been further customized for this specific mission. Additional fuel capacity extended their range, while enhanced stealth systems provided even greater protection from enemy detection. Weapons loadouts were tailored to each pilot's targets, requiring them to master new armament configurations during the final preparation phase. Sarah learned that her aircraft would carry precision missiles designed for use against hardened targets, along with conventional rockets for the secondary objectives she might encounter. The weapons systems had been modified to work with the stealth technology, requiring her to understand new engagement procedures that differed from her training experience. Commander Hayes outlined the extraction procedures that would follow mission completion. Each pilot would follow predetermined escape routes, designed to minimize their chances of detection or pursuit. Recovery operations would take place at separate locations using assets that were already positioned throughout the region. The backup plans were comprehensive, covering scenarios ranging from aircraft malfunction to pilot capture. Sarah memorized procedures for destroying sensitive equipment and information if her aircraft was disabled in enemy territory. She learned recognition codes for friendly forces who might assist with extraction if standard recovery procedures failed. Training for the mission began immediately at the secure facility. Flight simulators replicated the exact terrain and conditions they would encounter, allowing pilots to practice their approaches repeatedly until every turn and landmark was memorized. The simulations included enemy defenses and various malfunction scenarios that tested their ability to adapt and overcome unexpected challenges. Sarah flew her simulated mission dozens of times, experimenting with different approach angles and timing variations until she found the optimal combination of stealth and effectiveness. Each practice run revealed new details about the terrain and potential complications that could affect mission success. The psychological preparation intensified as the mission date approached. Military specialists worked with each pilot to ensure they were mentally ready for the stress of independent operations in hostile territory. They practiced decision-making exercises under extreme pressure and reviewed procedures for maintaining focus during extended periods of high stress. Equipment checks became obsessive as the launch date neared. Every system was tested repeatedly to ensure perfect functioning during the mission. Sarah inspected her aircraft daily, learning its individual characteristics and quirks that could affect performance during critical moments. She developed the kind of intimate familiarity with her machine that only came from countless hours of preparation. The night before the mission, Sarah found herself unable to sleep, despite her exhaustion. She reviewed her flight plan one final time, visualizing each phase of the operation, from takeoff to landing. The route was burned into her memory, but she wanted to ensure that fatigue or stress wouldn't cause her to forget crucial details during execution. Her target briefing filled several thick folders with intelligence that had been gathered over months of observation. She studied photographs of her objectives from every available angle, memorizing structural details that would help her place weapons with maximum effectiveness. The precision required left no room for error or approximation. Launch day arrived with weather conditions that matched the forecast predictions. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with unusual thoroughness, knowing that any equipment failure during the mission could compromise not just her own objectives, but the entire operation. Her aircraft responded perfectly to every test, confirming that the extensive preparation had prepared both machine and pilot for what lay ahead. The flight to her initial navigation point took her over terrain she had memorized during weeks of preparation. Every landmark appeared exactly as expected, confirming the accuracy of her navigation planning and building her confidence for the more challenging phases ahead. Radio silence was already in effect, leaving her alone with her thoughts and responsibilities. As she approached enemy territory, Sarah activated the stealth systems that would make her aircraft nearly invisible to detection. The technology worked flawlessly, but she knew that her own flying skills would determine whether that advantage was maintained throughout the mission. Every movement had to be precise and deliberate to avoid compromising her hidden approach. The mountain passes that led to her target area required navigation skills that challenged everything she had learned during training. Flying through narrow valleys while maintaining stealth configuration pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. But her preparation proved adequate for the demanding conditions she encountered. Her first target appeared exactly where intelligence had predicted. Built into the mountain face, in a location that seemed impossible to attack, the approach required her to fly directly toward a rock wall before making a sharp turn that brought her weapons to bear on the concealed facility. The precision required was extraordinary, but her training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The weapon's release was perfectly timed, sending precision missiles into the target with accuracy that exceeded her expectations. Secondary explosions confirmed that the strike had achieved its objectives, eliminating a key enemy capability that had threatened American forces throughout the region. Her second target required an approach through a canyon so narrow that her rotor blades almost touched the walls on both sides. The enemy supply depot was hidden at the end of this natural corridor, protected by terrain that made conventional attack impossible. Sarah navigated the treacherous passage with skill developed through months of intensive preparation. The final weapons release completed her mission objectives, destroying facilities that had taken the enemy months to construct and supply. As she turned toward her extraction route, Sarah felt the satisfaction of knowing that her years of training and weeks of preparation had contributed to a mission that would have significant strategic impact. The flight to her recovery point took her through different terrain, following a route designed to avoid any enemy forces that might have been alerted by the attacks. Her stealth systems continued to function perfectly, keeping her invisible to detection systems that might have compromised less sophisticated aircraft. Landing at the designated recovery site, Sarah was greeted by support personnel who immediately began preparing her aircraft for return to base. Their efficiency suggested extensive experience with operations of this type, confirming that her mission was part of a larger effort that extended far beyond what any individual pilot could see. The debriefing process began immediately, with intelligence specialists eager to confirm mission results and gather information that would support future operations. Sarah provided detailed accounts of everything she had observed, from enemy defensive positions to terrain features that could affect subsequent missions in the region. Captain Morrison congratulated her on mission success, noting that all 6 pilots had achieved their objectives without detection or loss. The operation had eliminated enemy capabilities that had threatened American interests for months, while demonstrating the effectiveness of the specialized training and equipment that had made the mission possible. As Sarah returned to her regular duties, she carried with her the knowledge that her skills and dedication had contributed to something truly significant. The training had been demanding and the mission dangerous, but the results justified every challenge she had overcome. She had proven to herself and others that determination and preparation could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The classified nature of the operation meant that its success would never be publicly acknowledged. But Sarah needed no external recognition to know that she had accomplished something extraordinary. The silent moment when she had stood up in response to the SEAL captain's question had led to experiences that defined her as both a pilot and a person. Years later, when younger pilots asked her about the most challenging mission of her career, Sarah would smile and change the subject. Some stories were too important to tell, and some achievements were measured not by public recognition, but by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when her country needed her most, she had answered the call without hesitation.